So that's what happens when you, for example, switch power tubes in an amplifier that has a specific design. It has a particular output transformer, a power transformer, a certain kind of phase inverter, a certain kind of amount and type of negative feedback. It was designed around the specifications of, let's say, a 6L6. Mm-hmm. You take the 6L6s out, put EL34s in, and, they're going to run kind of hot that way, so let's just rebias it so that they don't get too hot. And okay, I've compensated the amp. No, you've only compensated one out of about 5 parameters that needed to be changed.
Hello boys and girls, and welcome to another guitar amp myth busting video. I am here in LA at the, you can see it, Fryette headquarters, and I'm very happy to be here with the man himself. Somebody at NAMM just called him the Yoda of the guitar amp world. And you have sent me a lot of questions. I have got a lot of questions, so this is gonna be a highly interesting and very nerdy guitar amp video. Welcome, Mr. Steven Fryette.
Nice to be here. Thanks for coming to visit our factory. I'm trying to think of how Yoda speaks. Doesn't he kind of talk backwards?
Yeah, right. Like, you have to flip like the... Yeah. Haven't you worked on that yet? How was NAMM for you?
NAMM, I've just decided that for the rest of time, NAMM is just going to be a big petri dish of bacteria, and that's the way it's going to be. It's never going to change.
So far, I was lucky. I'm still up and running and filming. So I didn't... They call it Namthrax, right?
Namthrax. I'm a victim of Namthrax. It wasn't severe. It wasn't bad. But several of my colleagues did get COVID. So I tested for COVID 2 or 3 days in a row to make sure that I didn't get it. Because, of course, I'll bring it here.
Sure.
And then... we're a small, close-knit group, and then that means we're out of commission for 2 weeks.
What did you miss in other amp designs when you started? I think it was VHT, your first company, right? So what did you want to create, or what brought you into designing amps?
I wasn't really trying to create an amplifier. I was just trying to solve my personal problems.
Which was?
As a player.
Okay.
Just what was out there available to me at the time.
Wasn't satisfying?
That's right.
Okay.
Mostly on a functional level, really. Playing in different kinds of bands, different kinds of music, different instruments, different environments. And
you wanted something else. You were looking for your tone, couldn't find it. And
I don't know if I was even that cognizant of my own tone yet. I was more just... I just wanted to hear what I wanted to hear in my... I guess that is what your own tone is, but it can be in there, and you can be shooting for that without necessarily thinking, I'm trying to make my signature on the world. Right. Yeah, no, I was pretty green to guitar playing, so while I was doing that, I'm also trying to learn how to play a guitar in the first place, right? Because
I think the first time I got in touch with VHT, I remember that, was in a guitar shop in Frankfurt, maybe very late 90s, early 2000s, and that was the PITTBULL, I think CL, right, or something?
Could have been.
Could have been, which I couldn't afford. But I was amazed by how we metal people call it dry or tight, that distortion sounded. So there was a lot of gain, but it felt very articulate, very precise. Showed my bad playing very clearly. Again, couldn't...
And mine.
And yeah, of course. I'm worse. I'm sure I'm worse. No,
well, but yeah, don't be so hard on yourself. But I mean, I had these dual battles going on because I'm learning how to play the instrument, and I actually wanted the amp. I wanted my gear to not hide the truth from me. To be honest, because how I was going to learn if I'm if I'm putting the Vaseline on the lens, right? How am I going to get any better?
Okay.
So then I just sort of fell into the habit of gravitating towards amps that had some clarity.
Was the PITTBULL the first amp or something? Or how was...
Our first product was the 2150 power amp.
Okay.
Which is interesting because the PITTBULL was the first thing that got developed. It was the first thing that I worked on, which is, like I said, designing an amp for myself way before the power amps started happening. But the rack thing started happening at the same time.
Right, yeah.
And that's where the other sort of aspect of our company's personality comes in, which is the problem-solving part. So once people started putting racks together, there wasn't a lot of choices in rack power amps. They were either like
Mesa Boogie
and pretty much H&H. And not too many people knew about H&H until Lukather started using them, or Eddie Van Halen started using them. I brought in the PITTBULL prototype to a store for people to play through and see what they thought. And one of the guys at the store said, if you put the power amp section of that into a rack, that would be killer. And I went, I wonder if that would be killer. So I built a prototype of that and took it back to that store and showed it to them. And the owner of the store came out and just said, can you make some more of those? And how much would it cost to make more of those? And I'm like, I don't know. So that's why the 2150 came out first, because that became
there was a demand for it.
That was the immediate demand. And again, I wasn't really even trying to start a company. I was just looking to sort of supplement my income. The stuff that was out there on the market were called switchable channel amplifiers, but they were really only one channel. They either had a good sounding clean channel and a terrible sounding overdrive, or vice versa. And from the time that I was working in repair shops, especially Valley Arts, especially doing modifications rather than repairs, and figuring out how to add features or improve the performance of existing gear that was out there, putting an effects loop in was a big thing. And we were doing that pretty early on. So when amplifiers started coming out with effects loops in them, it was like, oh, they already put the effects loop in it. This is great. And you put something in the loop and it was terrible.
So you improved the effect loop?
So it was like, had to go in and look at, okay, so what is it about an effects loop that is good or bad? So I was working on all three of those sort of areas at once, getting a multi-function amplifier that actually had multiple functions that were equivalent in function,
and all sounded good and all worked, and
consistent in utility, as opposed to one aspect got all the attention from the designer, and the other one was just an afterthought. Everything had to get a high level of attention to detail, and from that I discovered that you really needed to pay a lot more attention to a clean channel architecture than you needed to for overdrive.
Really? But talking about overdrive channels, because there's one question that has been asked many times, and that is, I'm also curious, what defines the character of the distortion the most? Is that the type of clipping, or is it mainly filtering, or is it both, or does it depend? So what makes, especially like a preamp distortion, because where I come from, it's mostly preamp distortion, what defines the sound? What makes it dry or saturated or tight or whatever,
It starts with the very input stage.
Okay.
And it's refined at the very end. So what happens between there is up to anybody's interpretation, and that's why so many different sort of variations on a theme occur, because they reflect the individual designer's sort of preference for a certain kind of distortion character. But overall, what defines how what that amp's personality is going to be is the pre-EQ, what happens right after the very first stage, how you predispose the shape of the signal
that goes into the clipping,
that goes into the EQ stages and the overdrive stages and all that. That has to be pretty well defined and refined first.
Okay.
And then once everything is all done, and it's going to be amplified and sent to the speakers, the power amp is the next important thing that has to be working right for clean and overdrive to work right. And the power amp is a lot harder thing.
Really? Okay.
Much harder, because it has.
And you're known for designing one of the most legendary power amps. And it's right there. You can't see it, but.
And my attraction to power amps goes way back to my grade school days, in junior high school days, when I was building my own stereo gear from kits. And one of the first things I built was a Dynakit power amp, which Dynaco was a company that made amplifier kits like Heathkit in the 50s and 60s. I became really enamored of hi-fi gear. I started subscribing to all the hi-fi magazines. And from that, I started wanting to build a hi-fi system for myself. I had my own bedroom, and I had a place where I could set up a stereo system. So I started looking into that and seeing how much they were, and then I discovered Dynaco kits. I went, well, that I can save enough paperboy money to buy that this month, and then 3 months later I can afford to buy the preamp. Then before I knew it, I had a full-blown stereo system. But I really was intrigued by the power amp thing first. I saw that as the key, most important thing.
One thing I noticed is how different guitar power amps can sound. And the other thing I noticed, because that is another question, is that it's not a matter of the tubes that much, at least not as much as people think. People think like whatever EL34 is going to give me that character, and if I switch the tubes, it's going to be totally different. So my impression is, and correct me if I'm wrong, that power amp design is incredibly important, like crucial for the tone of an amp, but it's not that much. Maybe the tube itself, is that correct? Or what defines the tone of a power amp?
The tone of a power amp is kind of a misnomer, because you want the power amp to not impose a tone. On paper, you want it to amplify, you want it to reproduce everything that you're sending to it.
Okay, yeah.
That's the hi-fi mentality.
Yeah.
It's not supposed to impose its personality. Same with the speakers. But the reality of a guitar amp is we've already been influenced by the guitar amplifiers that we've heard in the past. And even though I started as a drummer, I heard my first exposure to a guitar amp was my brother's first Supro amp. And my next exposure to a guitar amp was my brother's Fender Concert. They all had their distinctly different personalities, but I think early on I understood that the personality wasn't any one component. It was the sum total of the whole thing. So when the discussion comes to the sound of tubes, it's a misread. It's a misunderstanding of what the tubes are doing and how they're doing it in the amplifier. But because when you change the tube in an amplifier, things change, you assign that change to the tubes.
Oh, yeah, sure.
But what's actually happening is when you have big tires on your car, and then you put smaller tires on that car, and the whole handling and performance of the suspension changes, you assign all that change to the different tires you put it on. But that isn't what caused the change. What caused the change was the suspension system was designed for these particular tires, and when you change the tires and didn't compensate the suspension, everything changed.
It makes no sense.
And it's like this and like this. So that's what happens when you, for example, switch power tubes in an amplifier that has a specific design. It has a particular output transformer, a power transformer, a certain kind of phase inverter, a certain kind of amount and type of negative feedback, often and sometimes not. And it was designed around the specifications of, let's say, a 6L6. You take the 6L6s out, put EL34s in, and they're going to run kind of hot that way. So let's just rebias it so that they don't get too hot. And okay, I've compensated the amp. No, you've only compensated one out of about 5 parameters that needed to be changed. So what you hear is not formerly the sound of the 6L6 and afterwards the sound of the EL34. What you actually heard was the sound of the amplifier operating as it was designed to operate with the 6L6s in it, and then the amplifier operating as it was not designed to operate with the improper tubes in it at the wrong impedance, at the wrong grid voltage, screen voltage, current handling of the power supply, the way the feedback network is designed to compensate the linearity of the amp with the 6L6s in it. The amplifier is amplifying signal. The signal is going to the speaker output. A little bit of signal from the speaker output is fed back into the power amp. That is designed to flatten out and compensate for some of the quirkiness in the output transformer, which are often emit little behaviors that you kind of want to suppress. Once you change the power tube, if that power tube doesn't have the same transconductance as the other power tube that was in it, it has a different gain. And when it has less gain, it has less negative feedback. And that means the output transformer gets a chance to be a little spikier.
Things get out of balance again.
And depending what speaker you have plugged in it, which is also part of the feedback loop because the speaker influences that, then the speaker sounds different. So really what changed was the whole amplifier topology changed because you changed the tubes and didn't compensate for all the different ways that that tube will behave in the circuit.
So that means when you design a power amp, it's always like a whole system based around a certain tube, and that's how it's supposed to be used.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And in fact, the Deliverance, I purposely did it with 6550/KT88. I did it around that platform just to prove a point. So when we first showed it to people, and they were playing through it, and like, wow, this is really great. This is good, blah, 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 blah. What EL34s are in there? 6550s. Well, no, I was asking you what EL34s are in there. 6550s. That doesn't sound like a 6550 amp. Okay, define a 6550 amp, please. We found ourselves in the position of having to educate people about these things. And unfortunately, a small company with a smaller voice in the marketplace gets drowned out by a larger company with a larger voice saying and trying to sell the opposite concept. That makes you wrong because look at all the people that are playing their amplifier.
Next question is about load boxes. Also, several people asked something into this direction because you also just built a very successful product, which is not only a load box, but so why do different load boxes sound different, and what makes a load box sound great or sound right? In a nutshell.
Well, I have to kind of approach that question the same way as the tube question because the load box doesn't really sound. What it does is it presents a load to an amplifier that sounds. So what makes load boxes sound different is because they cause the amplifier to behave in a different way. Ideally, if you have an amp and a cabinet and you want to attenuate it, say for example, that means that you need to load the amp down so that you can dissipate some of its volume output power as heat.
Into heat,
And then whatever is left goes to the speaker. And that's what was going on in the late 80s and early 90s. We would just take load resistors and put them across a head and then pad that down into a line level. Not much else was paid attention to that at that time. And then later on, it became, well, you know, if the load was reactive, it would behave more like speaker.
Right.
So as I was saying, when you have a head that's going into a cabinet, the amp sounds the way it does because the speaker behaves the way it does, and the cabinet construction influences that.
Yeah.
And
they're talking to each other.
They're talking to each other. Thank you. The more effectively and successfully you can fool the amp into thinking that it's plugged into the speaker that it was designed to be used with, you'll say that sounds the best.
The closer it sounds to the actual.
The closer it sounds the actual thing is, the closer it sounds good.
Right.
The more you will say it sounds good because it sounds right.
But then also it depends on which speaker you use. So it will just be like a snapshot of one sound, which you can recreate. Let's say it has been designed to be used with a greenback or with a vintage radio or whatever.
Right.
And that's what you get, but you're not going to get the other thing, right? So you design it into a certain behavior of that speaker, a certain...
Right. Now, the trick about that is people associate that sound with a frequency curve.
Yeah.
Like when you look on the Celestian's website or the Eminence website or any speaker's website, you'll see the frequency graph. There's another graph that nobody pays attention to or didn't used to pay attention to until recently called the impedance curve.
Yeah.
The impedance curve describes how the speaker behaves on
different frequencies, right?
Right. How the mechanical mass of the speaker reacts to the signal being put through it at different frequencies. So that's an entirely different behavior.
So what you're trying to recreate is the impedance curve of a certain speaker, right?
Right.
Try to emulate that. So
Right.
the amp believes I'm connected to a speaker.
Right. And you need to know one more thing about that impedance
Okay.
curve chart. And that is it's created with a solid-state amplifier. A very high power, very low impedance solid-state amplifier.
Okay.
Which means that amplifier's job is to not impose anything upon the behavior of that speaker under test to generate that curve. So when you look at when you look at an impedance curve, what you're looking at is a speaker driven by a solid-state amp. So when you plug that same speaker into a guitar amp, that impedance curve shifts in a lot of ways. And so what's the reason that the speakers with different frequency responses, but their impedance curve is very similar, is because the way they were tested, not the way they behave.
Okay.
And then you change the whole relationship of the speaker to the amplifier by plugging it into your guitar amp. Now, the difference between this amp and this amp plugged into that speaker is way, way different than the differences of two different manufacturers' speakers' impedance curves.
I understand.
So that's a big rug that comes out from under the feet of anybody trying to describe what that is and how to replicate it, how to emulate it, how to dial it in and fine tune it.
Wow.
So when I was looking at that and when I was thinking, I wonder if there's a place in the market for us to come up with something, I started experimenting with reactive loads. And when I started learning what they really were and how they related to the speaker specifications I was looking at, I went, really the problem with attenuators isn't that they're attenuators, but it's that there's a relationship between the speaker and the amp that's way more important than these curves suggest. And that's the thing
You want to get right.
when you want to get right. That's the thing that you need to preserve. That's the thing that people, when they're saying this is what sounds right, what they're reacting to is this thing sounding right. It's a different thing that they're reacting to than what they think they're describing. I looked at that and I went, okay, two things have to happen. The reactive load has to have a little bit of range and flexibility so that you're not locked into what people will think of as one particular speaker's behavior. So we have to break that mindset.
Okay.
And in describing that, we have little switches that we can show. See, we can tweak the high frequency rise, we can tweak the low frequency resonant point, the amplitude and the position. We can do those kinds of things, and while those won't necessarily exactly track a particular speaker, they will suggest the behaviors that you're looking for.
So I got a few options to fine tune, to shift it into a certain direction.
And if you only have that doing that job of absorbing the load and fooling the amp into reacting a certain way, that's the job. That's where you stop. Then the rest of it, if you try to take the remainder of the power that comes off of the load box and try to run that to the speaker can no longer influence the behavior of the amplifier because it's got the attenuator in the way. My solution for that goes all the way back to my Dynaco power amp days, which is a neutral power amp that is still a vacuum tube power amp. As such, it's got the impedance characteristics of a tube power amp. And it's got a feedback network in it like most tube power amps have, which is, in the old days, you just used the minimal amount of feedback needed to get a linear frequency response pattern out of it when it was tested for its audio performance. Keep it relatively flat and then drive the speaker with it. And what you will hear is, again, even the fact that the power amp itself didn't modify the tone of the amplifier that much, what you'll experience is that it did, and that's because the speaker that's connected to it is making it do that. That's always been the thing that fascinates me. And when I realized that was working, and I tried several different amplifiers, a Fender, a Marshall, a Hi-Watt, and every other thing that I could get my hands on to try it, I found the same thing, which was I could set them up to where they were exactly the same volume and switch the bypass switch on and off and hear almost no perceptible difference.
Wow. Which are your favorite amps? And because I expect you to name like very old and classic amps, I also want you to include something contemporary if possible.
Yeah, I gave that one a lot of thought, actually. And I'm still working on it. Because there's, like everything you asked me, there's a whole lot wrapped up in it.
Yeah.
Contemporary amps.
Here we go.
First of all, like I said, that first impression, I have to look at something and go, that looks pretty interesting. Like, oh, cool, looks interesting. I have to go check out and see what it's about. If something looks abominable to me, then I'm just not motivated to go any further than that. The first time I experienced the SOLDANO amp, I wasn't that enamored of it visually.
Oh, the look, yeah.
But I did notice some things that I recognized in other amps. Like, for example, in high watt amps, it might have been the high watt preamp tubes were pop riveted to the chassis. And in the SOLDANO amp, the power tube sockets were pop riveted to the chassis. And normally you would look at a pop rivet and say, well, that's a really cheap way to assemble something. But when I looked at that, I went, this guy's kind of like me. If I saw the way an amplifier that I respected was built and it was built that way, then I would probably be predisposed to doing it that way because somebody that I thought was doing a good job of building an amp did it that way. They must have done it for a good reason. Yeah. Whereas you see some real cheap piece of crap that sounds like a piece of crap and see pop rivets and stuff, you go, that's just cheap, one piece of every other piece about this that has that sort of thing you don't like. So I thought the SOLDANO thing was interesting, and then when I saw how it was built inside, I was kind of conflicted because there's all this really neat wiring, sort of high watt style, real straight wire harness layout. Really clean, really neat, really carefully looked after. But it was done on circuit boards, which I had no problem with. But they were single-sided circuit boards. Again, I have no problem with it. Lots of amplifiers ampegs were made single-sided. Music Mans were made single-sided. Lots of amplifiers were made single-sided before anybody even started talking about whether PCBs mattered or not. It only mattered after somebody got bent out of shape about it, and then the whole community got bent out of shape about it. But it didn't matter really before that until people started doing it really badly. But I saw this single-sided circuit board, which was kind of like, oh, I see. So he's taken a little bit of sort of the high watt ethos and blended it with a little bit of the Marshall JMP era ethos of single-sided PCBs that were etched. They were they were laid out with tape. It's called tape, tape and etch. And so he had done that, and I went, okay, all right. So he picked one from column A, one from column B, and sort of assembled this whole thing that had a really nice sound. I played through it, and I thought maybe this will be the amp that I don't have to make my own. So I met him. We became buddies. I took it to rehearsal and tried it, and I just kind of went,
almost.
I want to love this, but the overdrive was too compressed for me, and it wasn't a clean enough of a clean to satisfy those two requirements. So I just went back and I went, really nice job. Best of luck. I'll refer people to you,
but not my cup of tea, or not what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I told him, I was hoping you were going to save me having to stick my nose farther into amp world, and unfortunately that didn't happen, and I'm kind of disappointed. I was hoping you were going to rescue me from that, because I know what a rabbit hole it's going to be. And he kind of laughed, and then I went on my way. I had met a guy in Germany that was introduced me by a friend who said, this guy takes Marshalls and puts the PITTBULL preamp in them, modifies them into the PITTBULL front end for guys that can't afford PITTBULLs. And
when was that?
This was probably 90, 92.
Okay.
91, 92. So I went over to he's got a little booth, and he's about to release his own amp, and I went over there. It was Peter DIEZEL. And we talked, hit it off, played through his amp. I thought, this looks very German. This looks very German with the angled rows of controls. And I thought, I am an OCD crazy person, and this guy just
next
totally
level.
Next level.
Great amps, I guess.
Yeah, and later on when I got a chance to look inside, I went, okay, this is a guy that I can have a continued friendship with, because in there he put way more work into the layers and layers of layout in the extreme. I went, this guy is really in that German engineering mindset. It was a bit over the top for me, but I saw the reason for everything he was doing, and I could appreciate that. So that was one that I thought was really nice. Of course, Reinhold Bogner and I are buddies. He has a totally different way of approaching his amps than I do, and I can appreciate what he does, and I like the sound of his amps. And I also like, I like his approach to cosmetics. It's totally off the wall. Some of it is just really nutty, but that's Reinhold. It's a perfect expression of his personality. So
DIEZELs also have a very distinct look. Love them.
And so you look at those, and they draw you in. They make you want to I want to learn more about this.
Yeah.
But then I'll see something else, and I'll just go, I don't want to know any more about that than I have to. So those are contemporary ones. I find that I have such a deeply embedded obsession with early 70s high watts and like that
nothing's going to top that.
When I listen to a contemporary amp that has some of those elements in it, then I go, okay, there's another brother for me to open up a dialogue with, because we'll have something to talk about over a beer.
So the next question is maybe a little more simple. Somebody asked, why does nobody add parametric, or probably semi-parametric, mid filters to a guitar amp? My answer would be because most guitarists are too stupid for that.
That's definitely.
But then bass players get it, which makes no sense either. But what's your take on this? At least you're putting graphic EQs into some of your amps, which is also not very common.
Yeah, and I can explain that too in a way that you probably didn't think of. So, but let's get to why that doesn't happen very often, if at all. It actually did happen in the late 70s and early 80s with the Yamaha. Was it the R112?
Okay.
Yamaha basically made a solid state deluxe. It was the size of a deluxe. It had a Fenderish look. It had an angled front panel.
Okay.
It had Fendery looking knobs on it. It was a Yamaha solid state deluxe. It was a 100-watt amp. It was they came out with that when Rivera was working there.
Mm-hmm.
And he was involved in the development of that. And it had a adjustable parametric, so a cut and boost and a frequency select.
Yeah.
And it was a very effective way to pull off the Rivera mid boost that he was modifying into the deluxes at the time.
Okay.
That was my first experience of a practical parametric on an amp. However, for the most part, a lot of the designers that are making amps are designers. They're kind of sound designers. They're not really engineering types, and they're not really capable of creating something like that. They would have to farm it out to somebody else, and then back and forth, getting the frequencies right. So that's one reason. And then the next reason is that the people that would be designing that thing, that circuit, that design, that functionality, they don't understand guitar players well enough to try to hone it in to what will really work for a guitar player and the guitar player mentality. Trying to design it around the way guitar players think of amplifiers, that's a difficult thing. And the last thing is, like you said,
you don't want to confuse them.
the first thing they're going to do is they're going to set it to some horrible frequency and turn it all the way up and go, look what the great sound I just made out of this. And it's like screeching. But
you all go like, this amp sucks. you know,
yeah. Or turn it all the way to the left and try to make a V scoop. Yeah. Well, I was trying to make a V scoop, but it's not wide enough to. Can you change the something to make? You know, they're always going to come back with questions. I just think that it's not
a weapon you want to give them.
Yeah.
But then again, graphic EQs, right? It's like.
Okay, so when
I love the one. You can see, the one I have, that synergy module. It's just a little, very effective and great sounding.
And that was a little different than needing to be there, and I'll explain that. But we made the Pitbull head, the classic, and which later became the CLX. And as always happens when you make a new amplifier, if you make a combo, somebody's going to ask for a head. If you make a head, they'll ask for a combo. So once the Pitbull head started moving under its own steam, we started getting feedback about it being smaller, which is kind of ridiculous. So you just basically take the same side head and put it into a package with 2 speakers in it that just by design, it's an open back cab, or even if it was closed back, it still would leak so much air that would effectively be an open back. And therefore would need to have more speakers with higher power handling capacity because there's less of them and there's air leakage, or they're open back and you're going to blow them more frequently, and they're not going to sound like 4 speakers in a 412 cab with a sealed back, and they're especially not going to sound like greenbacks. So the EQ wasn't a facility to make the amp sound 89 different ways. The idea was to be able to dial it in so that you could make it sound like a half stack, voicing wise.
Okay.
Which was a way more subtle intention for a design than the average guitar player understood it.
But it is very effective for really like taking things upside down and
right. Well, one of the things that I wanted to do is make sure that people didn't see it as a Mesa EQ.
Right. That's
which was
the other.
The whole idea of is that you made a V out of it because the Mesas were so mid-range intense. But that's how they got all that sustain and that honk. But you needed the EQ to take all that mid-range out once you established the mid-range gain characteristic. Like in the old days of radio, there was a knob on there that had a 2-position switch. One was music and one was voice. And the voice one rolled off all the bass and the treble. And that's basically what Mesa did. They just rammed mid-range all the way through the preamp stage, and then when it got before the power amp, goes through the EQ, and you do this, and you shape it after the sustain and gain and all that is already established, so it doesn't take that away. It just reshapes it.
Only the frequency response.
But that became the way to make a Mesa sound metal was to V the EQ. So when we came out with the EQ, I made a 6-band EQ so that there wouldn't be a middle band that you put to the bottom. I was deliberately trying to, cock block that propensity to do that. And I was always thinking ahead of the stupidest guitar players that I could imagine, and figure out how to prevent them from digging their own grave. Actually, that EQ was designed to key off of more of the harmonics around the guitar, the instrument itself, the body resonance, the neck resonance, the bridge, the kind of the metal that's on the bridge and the tailpiece and those kinds of things. The frequencies on our EQ were designed to key off of the different mechanical behaviors of the guitar than the amplifier. And that's why it's so effective, because it really reacts to the different ways that guitars react when plugged into an amp. And so we just left it at that. And then after a while, people started asking for the EQ to be in the heads, and not wanting to really make our lives that complicated. We decided to make it an option. If you really wanted it, we'll put it in.
All right, I remember. That was optional.
So we made it an option. But after a while, the more sophisticated dealers and distributors started ordering them all with EQs on the marketing concept that it's fully loaded. It's got everything. It's all in there. And I'm like,
more is more.
You guys need to take a couple without the EQ. No, they don't want that. They want the full. They want that, the entire chili dog with the extra onions and cheese. And I'm like, yeah, I get that. And we just sort of acquiesced, and then just never really discussed it again. So then,
yes,
of course, when we started doing the modules, I knew that if we did the Ultra Lead module without the EQ, it was just going to be a huge backlash.
Yeah.
I thought, well, first, let's see if I could even get usable sliders that small. And I carved out a space for myself on the panel. I need this much space. And so this is the maximum length of a slider that I will be able to accommodate. And I went out and looked, and I found one. And of course, with all the other Synergy modules, the knobs are diagonally arranged because the size of the actual potentiometer inside on the circuit board is big. And they need to get the knobs close enough together to fit on the panel so they don't overlap the panel.
Yeah.
So they staggered them so that the body sizes of the pots would be like this rather than like this. I thought that was fine, except that overlaps this rectangular area I need to squeeze an EQ in there and get small enough sliders to fit in there, but I also have to be wide enough apart that you can actually grab them individually.
Yeah.
So I need some real estate that's not available using those pots. And that's why all of our modules have the pots stacked vertically on top of each other, because I changed the pots. And I went to them and I said, I'm working on the Ultra Lead and I'm getting back. It's going to be something special in it, isn't it? And I said, well, I hope so. I said, but there's going to be some concessions I'm going to need. And one of them is I'm going to need to not use your pots. Wow, we've bought all these pots. We have them in inventory. We have thousands. And I go, yeah, I knew that was going to be the reaction. But in order to give you what you're expecting to get from me, and I know you've got the bar up here already. I know that. I already have the supplier lined up. I've already approved the samples. And if you are having a problem with that, okay, I'll buy the pots myself and I'll keep them in inventory, and then I'll sell them to you at my cost when you're ready to go to production.
Because you're going to use them anyway?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. They went, okay, you're taking that whole burden of switching an inventory part off of us. Fine, go ahead and do it. Okay. But then when it actually came down to production, they started to see, once they saw the finished unit, they saw the wisdom of it, and then they went, screw it, we'll just buy them. It's okay.
Nice.
And then the beauty of it is how it benefited them going down the road was the 2CP.
Which you did with them, right?
I designed the 2CP for them, right. And because they were accommodating to me on the Ultra Lead, it opened the door for the 2CP to exist with its 5-band graphic.
Right, yeah, of course. Yeah.
So ultimately, it benefited everybody.
I love the module, gotta say that. I use it a lot. I actually used it a lot more than expected. Like the PITTBULL, it's called, is it called PITTBULL? Yeah, it's called PITTBULL Ultra Lead, right? Yeah. Which leads me to my personal question, and that is, this time coming from me, is there gonna be a PITTBULL 2, or is the Ultra Lead coming back, or the CL, the class?
The PITTBULL is coming back, and the reason for doing the Ultra Lead was to signal that there's something coming down the road.
I got triggered.
And that's why I really needed it to be the best expression of the Ultra Lead that I could make it.
Yeah.
And I can't really elaborate more on that at the moment, other than say that, like on the Deliverance 2 Plus is it's an enhancement. It's a subtle evolution of the Deliverance 2. The original Deliverance had this, and then we put a graphic. We put the effects loop in it later. The purpose of the Deliverance was to illustrate the signature of our sound, not necessarily that we can make a simple amp, but that the focus of the amp would be the Fryette voicing, the Fryette sound qualities. And then we can expand on that later. So that's why we put out the original Deliverance with no loop. This is stripped to the bone.
As pure as
there's
possible,
nothing that in there that can make you say, I don't know if this is, I really understand the sound of this. Maybe if it didn't have a loop, then I know that's coloring the sound. We needed to kill all possible pushback at the very beginning. And it bugged some people that it didn't have the loop, but it was a necessary thing to establish what we think is
the core of a...
Yeah, that with the different, like DIEZEL, BOGNER, SOLDANO, Friedman, Fryette, all these, the differences in their personalities is more subtle than it used to be, the difference between a Fender and a Marshall and a Mesa.
Yeah, sure.
So in order to articulate more to the potential, the player and the potential customer, we needed to make it really, really apparent what that was. And then the Deliverance 2 was that amp with some refinement and with the effects loop included, and the and the solo volume. We put the solo volume on that one so that you would be able to switch it from more to less mode, and then have the solo volume so you could play at two different volumes. Play it like a clean amp, play it like an overdriven amp. And then the Deliverance 2 Plus, an additional refinement and development where it way improves the character of the overdrive and its responsiveness, and especially makes the clean a much bigger, much more important feature of the amplifier than it was before.
Okay.
It's more central to the design of it. It's more up front, and it's more usable than it was before. So that's the kind of refinement that we're doing, because these are our flagship amplifiers. I'm about ready to go the next couple of days into the group meeting and tell people what the concept is, what my concept about what the Ultra Lead is going to be. And I'm just, I think I'm just in advance. I'm going to just hand out the eggs and the rotten tomatoes so they can get it over with right up front. and then once they get that out of their system, I'll lead them along to my way of thinking, and then they'll have some time to think about it, because that's the way it works here.
And how long is it going to take? Probably, is there a...
Well, I'm talking like it hasn't even started yet, but it's probably about 75% done.
Oh, okay.
But I'm at the stage where I can do something that I fully suspect that some people will be blown away, and other people will hate it with a bloody passion. But that's not a reason not to do it. That it's gonna kick ass. It's gonna have everything that the Ultra Lead did have, and then some. And then there's going to be another side of it that you're going to go, what?
Okay.
But once we explain to you what we're doing and why, you'll go, it's as sick as it sounds, it absolutely makes 100% good sense.
I'm ready to check it out whenever it's ready, and I'm even more curious now.
The essential part of it that you will love is when you plug into it, play it. There's no doubt that you're not going to turn your nose up at that. So I can hardly wait to unleash that one, and it actually has to come pretty soon, because it's intended to be part of the new Helmet tour, which starts in April, I think. So I've got a giant bug up my ass that I have to resolve really quickly in order to make that happen. That's the way it works.
If that helps, it makes me happy.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great. Absolutely.
I'm like a songwriter in that way, that, you can piss around with versions of a song for weeks and weeks and weeks. And then when the producer says, yeah, we booked the studio for Tuesday at 4 o'clock, and you better have that fucking song completed,
Same here. I love it when I have, when the bands have deadlines. If the master's got to be out in 2 days.
No excuses left.
Yeah, and no revisions and shit. It's just get it done and fuck off. And
thank you. That's right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was enlightening. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I absolutely had a really good time.
I'm looking forward to also checking out the new Deliverance, right? And the PITTBULL. More curious about the PITTBULL, actually. But I'm here waiting.
I did want to say thank you for what your expose on the P50 speaker. We weren't sure that if...
I did my thing,
We weren't sure how that was going to go, but the cool thing about it was you did your thing.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we didn't really talk much about was how important the speaker design is to our stuff. And I think the one thing that really separates us from a lot of even major manufacturers is that we're deeply involved in the design and even initiate the design of the speakers that we use.
Right.
And work closely with
it's the whole concept, right? The whole rig, basically, right? Or not the guitar,
and
but
that's
everything.
And that's why we have the Eminence that you checked out, and you found that they have a good reason to exist, which is why we don't do anything unless we feel it has a reason.
But it's also fun if you take. I mean, I know you designed it to be used in a certain way, but isn't it fun if somebody rips it out of there, takes it somewhere else,
absolutely,
and turns it into something meaningful somewhere else, you know?
And that's also why we have the Fane speakers, because we go way back with the Fanes. I go way back with Fanes because of Hiwatt.
Yeah.
And part of it is that we work effectively together in order to create the speakers that we came up with that turned into a speaker line that they could relaunch the Fane brand with. Okay. So that was like a very cooperative effort to get the new Fane off the ground and give me the speaker that I wanted forever.
Win-win.
The fact that the cabinet designs are tailored to those particular speakers so that the amplifiers behave the way we want them to into a cabinet, all of that.
That's something I haven't checked out yet. So I still gotta hear maybe both speakers in your cabs.
Yeah.
For some reason I've had quite a few VHT or Fryette amps in the studio over the years, but no cabs.
I think there's an opportunity for another conversation, because that's another deep dive that I think
cabinets and speakers, and you mean that world?
Yeah, and I think your situation is set up, especially suitably for that exploration, especially given what you did with the P50. I'm ready to have that conversation with you.
I'm ready to.
All right,
thanks
cool.
again.
All right.
Thanks to Steven, and thanks for watching. If you are still here, that means you are a real guitar amp nerd. Welcome to the club. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I see you in hell, motherfuckers. Bye-bye.